I haven't frankly decided yet. Is there anybody who would like to start off? Josh. Excellent. I think we'll probably start with you, Josh.
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah. So this is my first time ever being a speaker on an English language panel.
Anybody who would like to start off? Excellent. So for those of you joining us, my name is Robert Baines. I am the president of the NATO Association of Canada. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm just getting some feedback there. So my name is Robert Baines. I'm president of the NATO Association of Canada. And it's my pleasure to host a panel today on the issues of cyber stability that we are dealing with as we take on the COVID crisis as both the country of Canada and the alliance of NATO and many other alliances and corporations. Multilateralism is something that we all hold dear, that has seen us past more than 70 years of peace and security, and something that we are sure will enable us to live in peace and security in the future if we continue to value it as it should be valued. That is more or less the important mission of the NATO Association of Canada, to make sure that Canadians understand the value of security, the importance of NATO, and how much multilateralism gives to our country. Most Canadians don't usually have a moment to consider their security, but it is something that they should consider as much as they can and as often as they can. That's what we're here to do. We often put on events weekly. We do have multiple Zoom events scheduled for the future, so please check those out. And if you are interested in learning more or being more involved, we always are happy to have more members of the NATO Association of Canada. So with that, I would like to, first of all, hand it over to one of my program editors, Nicole Dory, to introduce our guests. After that, I will be asking them some specific preordained questions. And once we are finished with that, Nicole will be asking questions from the YouTube live audience. With that, Nicole, please go ahead.
Thank you, Robert. As Robert mentioned, my name is Nicole Dory, and I am the Women in Security Program Editor at the NATO Association. Before I begin introducing today's speakers, I would like to thank my colleague, Antalya Patia, who has helped me put this event together. This event will last about 1 hour and might go slightly longer if our speakers are able. In the second portion of our event, our speakers will be answering questions live from the audience. If you are using the YouTube Live, then you can use the sidebar chat to ask your questions, and I will try and ask as many questions as possible. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Ben Hiller, who is the portfolio lead on partner nations and international organizations at NATO HQ's Cyber Defense section, also specializing in emergency security policy division. Before joining NATO, Ben was responsible for cyber policy at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ben Dewitt leads Deloitte Canada's Data Protection and Privacy Division and is part of Deloitte's Cyber Risk Executive Team. She has over 15 years of experience in privacy governance frameworks, privacy and data protection programs, and is an expert in digital transformations. Josh Gold is a research assistant at U of T's Citizens Lab. His research focuses include cyberspace governance, military and intelligence capabilities in cyberspace, and internet governance. He is a board member of the Canadian International Council's Toronto branch and the Estonian Central Council of Canada. He was a visiting fellow at the Hague Program for Cyber Norms and an ICANN 66 Next Gen Fellow. With that, I hand it over to Robert.
Thanks so much, Nicole. So as you can see, we've got a really great range of discussant partners today. Beth takes a look at things a little bit from the corporate world and corporate governance. She has been passionate about the idea of trust and an economy of trust, really what multilateralism is all about. Ben, of course, is going to be taking a look at strictly a NATO point of view, but also the collaboration that NATO has with multiple multilateral organizations. And of course, Josh, coming from an organization like Citizen Lab at U of T, is going to be taking a look at things from a slightly more arm's length view, a bit more critical. So I'm so glad that all of you will be able to join us today. And Josh, starting with you, we and then going through each individual speaker, we've got our introductory question, which is, can you give us a general assessment of the state of multilateral cyber collaboration? What's good and what needs improvement?
Sure. So thanks so much to Robert and Nicole and the NATO Association of Canada for having me. For years, I've been attending your events and I've learned a lot. So it's very special for me to finally be speaking at one as well, especially alongside such important co-panelists and on such an important topic. Before I begin, I should stress that nothing that I say should necessarily be taken to represent the views of the Citizen Lab or the University of Toronto. I'm speaking purely in a personal capacity. But with that disclaimer out of the way, I'd like to start with my version of what is cyber governance, because I think that's very important to what is cyber stability, which is the topic of this discussion. So in my opinion, cyber governance refers to international efforts to govern how states are allowed to behave in cyberspace, which involves the promotion of a common framework for state behavior, including norms. Efforts to govern cyberspace are challenged, in my view, by a fundamental ideological divide between countries on how they see human rights and freedoms applying in cyberspace. On one side, you have states who frame free speech and access to information as fundamental threats. These countries are led by China, Russia, and other authoritarian nations who have asserted sovereign control over the internet and emphasize the term information security rather than cybersecurity when discussing threats in the digital domain. Opposing this are Western countries like the US, Canada, European Union countries, Australia, Japan, to whom it is vital that the internet remain free, open, interoperable, and in line with democratic and human rights values. I'm certainly oversimplifying here a bit, and the picture is not black and white, as Edward Snowden's revelations showed in 2013, but I think this generalized picture helps set the stage. Now, why does this divide between a free and open internet versus a controlled and sovereign one matter? Well, because it leads to a fundamental difference in how countries want to govern cyberspace, which makes agreement in key areas really difficult. But many still, regardless, believe that an international framework of rules for how states should behave in cyberspace is needed. And this is in large part because cyberspace is increasingly securitized and militarized as geopolitical conflict in the cyber domain continues to intensify. Many militaries and security services across the world publicly now acknowledge offensive cyber capabilities, including Canada. And major global cyber attacks have intensified in their damage and in their scope. And I can speak to some examples later if necessary. But what this all shows, in my opinion, is that attacks seem to be on the rise and are occurring more frequently and pushing more boundaries. And a lack of clarity in the international space is very dangerous in general, and especially dangerous for an alliance like NATO. In the COVID context, we've seen an increase in cyber-enabled disruption related to the pandemic, including attacks against hospitals in the Czech Republic and an airport in the Czech Republic, attacks against the US Department of Health and Human Services, and even attacks against the World Health Organization. Canada's been targeted too, with attacks against a medical research agency here and the Department Health Agency. And that's not secret information that you can look up in the news. Many of these attacks have been allegedly caused by state or state-supported actors. Now, in the United Nations, I would say that the United Nations is the leading venue for global governance efforts in cyberspace. Within that, there are two main UN bodies that deal with cyber governance. One is called the GGE, or the Group of Governmental Experts, and the other is called the OEWG, the Open-Ended Working Group. Please forgive the acronyms. I'll try to be as clear as possible. The GGE is a much smaller group that came out of an original Russian proposal in the late 1990s to put together some kind of global treaty for information weapons and information warfare. And the group has been meeting with originally 15 countries, now it's up to 25 countries, but they're kind of expert countries who try to deliberate on these rules for cyberspace. And the GGE is known for two main things. One was in 2013, when the group agreed that international law applies in cyberspace. And the second was in 2015, when the group agreed on a report of 11 norms. These are voluntary, legally non-binding norms for how states can behave in cyberspace. And this was endorsed by all countries at the United Nations General Assembly. The open-ended working group, which came out of a Russian proposal, has pretty much the same mandate, but a bit of a different form. And that's a more recent body. I've been following it closely, but I've exhausted my 5 minutes and I'm happy to speak more to that later. To conclude, in our discussion today, I'm going to draw most often on lessons and efforts happening in this UN context, including some countries' positions regarding COVID-related cyber attacks and how they might relate to existing norms and international law.
Perfect. I appreciate you trying to run on time. It's a difficult thing, I know. Beth, would you perhaps like to take a crack at what your general assessment is of the state of multilateral cyber collaboration?
You said Beth, right?
Yes,
Wasn't sure if I heard Beth or Ben. Okay,
sorry.
sorry about that. Yeah, no, thanks very much. I think maybe what I can do is shift a little bit and think about it in the context of business community, in the context of consumers, in the context of communities, families, people. And really, if I think about the evolution of cyber, what I like to think about is the evolution that we're seeing within this interconnected world and what that's meant for our social relations, what that's meant for our economic relations, what that means for our political relations. And so if we look at it from maybe where we were 20, 30 years ago, as we started to see digital and data come together, the rise of technology, entering into kind of a new industrial era, we really saw that the response was around standards and compliance to standards. So what is it that organizations can do to try to protect what's happening with the technology and with the use of data by aligning to some international standards that were set up, be there standards around payment systems with PCI compliance, be it standards around how you set up security programs, your information security management systems with ISO, be it the increase of data protection or privacy laws and standards and rules to govern that space. And so what we saw was really in the early 2000s, an era of compliance. So organizations would think about what are the types of controls that we need to have in place that will meet a minimum state of, or a minimum baseline of compliance to some industry practices, best practices. But what we started to see as digital tech data became more and more pervasive and part of our world was that cyber breaches, data breaches started to happen. It feels like every single year was, this is the year of the breach. This is the year of people being exposed. This is the year of identity theft. And so as we started to see that, organizations started to think about, well, maybe we're actually too reactive and too passive in how it is we're managing this risk. So what we needed to do is start to think more proactively about it and actually start to put in risk management programs. So we sort of moved from an era of compliance to one of an era of risk management. And we started to put in monitoring systems. We started to put in ways of being able to understand and to detect what was happening, be it through cyber espionage. But those monitoring programs came in place that then allowed us to start to think about how is it we can more proactively respond to this evolving threat landscape that's in front of us because of what's happening in this interconnected world. And then from there, we've moved into something that's far more complex. And indeed, in this COVID era, or this COVID time, something that is very complex, unprecedented, and brings a lot of uncertainty in terms of how we're going to engage. And so through this, we had to start to think about how do we actually operate outside of kind of normal systems of control. We had to start to rethink, what did cybersecurity mean? We had to start to rethink, what do our laws mean? We had to start to rethink, what is ethics? What are those norms that we want to play to? And so really what we're starting to see now in this new interconnected world is that everything is being connected. Cyber is everywhere. It's in our supply chains. It's in our human interactions. It's in our homes. So indeed, you know, the World Economic Forum has said that by 2022, there's going to be 1 trillion sensors connected to the network. And 50% of that network traffic is actually going to be driven through home appliances. So this really has an impact on how it is we think about the broadening of the ecosystem, the broadening of the information that's accessible in this ecosystem, the role that cyber attacks might have in that, what's going to happen, and how we're actually going to defend against that. So I would sort of say that brings this kind of movement to an era of complexity, brings the need to start to reimagine how we actually work in a cooperative environment. And so what does that mean for businesses and international organizations and government to actually work together to try to think about what it is we need to do to manage in this new interconnected world that brings around the new types of multilateral agreements. You talk about norms. So what are the principles that we need to operate and to govern? These are the types of questions that are going to be asked. And I think businesses and those that I consult with, we're really trying to move questions of ethics, questions of trust, questions of accountability, questions of appropriateness to the center of the decisions that they're making when they start to think about what the new business models are that they're going to have, especially now that we're operating in a COVID time, where more and more of what we have to do is very, very quickly adjust our business models and move to a much more digital world that we were in before. And I do think that that's going to raise some new questions about how we interact and how we negotiate.
Perfect. Very good start. Obviously from a much different point of view from Josh, and that's one of the reasons I'm so thrilled you're able to join us here, because it's that same pull between the individual and the company and the global market is the same thing we're seeing in a way between the demands of sovereignty and the goals of multilateralism. So it's not entirely distinct. So Ben, could I ask you to answer the same kind of 30,000 foot view, your general assessment of the state of multilateral cyber collaboration?
Sure, and also thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm very thrilled to be part of this. I think I will probably follow on more what Josh said in terms of what international organizations are doing when it comes to cybersecurity. And I think the bottom line really from our perspective here at NATO is that cybersecurity is a global challenge. So you need global responses to mitigate threats and to manage cyber stability also between states. And one way, of course, is doing this is at the United Nations, as Josh said, but then also, of course, there are organizations such as NATO, groups of like-minded states that share similar values and have similar ideas when it comes to cyberspace governance. And what NATO and these organizations allow states to do is really to amplify their objectives and to promote their vision of how cyberspace should look like. In addition, I think international organizations or multilateral fora such as NATO also offer very good platforms to bring different interest communities together. For instance, at NATO, we not only cooperate between states when it comes to cyber defense and security, but we also cooperate with industry, with academia, but also citizens themselves. So since cybersecurity is a shared responsibility between all these stakeholders, it's important that we create spaces where all these stakeholders can meet and share expertise and experiences in order to promote a vision of cyberspace that we are very keen to have. And I would say that is very much the vision of an open, secure, stable cyberspace anchored in international law and norms of responsible state behavior. Now, in terms of what NATO does, of course, we have a very unique view on this topic. We are a political military alliance. We stand to prevent conflict. We share similar values. And we view cyber defense really through the lens of collective defense. So what allies have decided already a couple of years ago is that when it comes to cyber attacks that are significant, that it can trigger an Article 5 response. That means a collective response if states so decide. And that is a case-by-case decision. So cyber defense is part of collective defense. And if you make cyber defense part of collective defense, then you have to obviously make sure that everyone's prepared to deal with consequences, but also is able to prevent cyber attacks from impacting too significantly on your national systems. And that's really the main and the core business of what NATO is doing. States help each other in terms of becoming more resilient in terms of cyber defense. We offer training opportunities for cyber defenders. We offer cyber exercises for states to train and practice cyber defense strategies. And we also offer a political dialogue. For instance, that's very important now when you look at the COVID crisis and how some actors and threat actors are exploiting the situation to launch very, I would say, evil, even cyber attacks on the healthcare providers. We've seen examples of that in the past, and that's unacceptable. And NATO offers a platform for allies to discuss these sort of threats and what sort of response options there should be out there in order to respond to that. So in short, multilateral organizations offer a platform for coordination, for enhancing resilience, for building capacity, and in the understanding that if you do this together and challenge a global threat, then you probably are likely to be more successful in the long term. And that, of course, on the practical level means to create communication lines, to create platforms where you share information such as on vulnerabilities, technical information on cyber threats, etc., etc. So all these things have been instituted here in NATO to help allies to respond to cyber threats more effectively, both individually, but also collectively. So when it comes to your question, is multilateralism working? Or what needs to be improved? I think when we look at NATO, it is working. There are very clear mechanisms that have been established. And we are standing together when it comes to these threats and are responding. Now, of course, it is every state's responsibility to deal with these threats by themselves. But what I'm trying to put out there is the message that by having allies and partners and the ability to share this information and to get information from other allies, you stand in a much better space.
Perfect. So I'd like to jump right off of that. We had a series of questions prepared, and I'd like to start off, because you've just been talking about the value of sharing and how that sharing has improved our intelligence, but also our ability to respond to unknown threats. I'd perhaps like to come back to Beth, if you would mind starting us off, just talking a little bit about your impression of the trust-based economy. The trust-based economy is a term that has garnered a great deal of support recently. The idea is that the economy of trust is based on non-zero-sum worldview, where trust is foundational for stability and growth. This has often been only applied to the analog world. And could you just discuss a little bit about how the view could fit into cyberspace and cyber governance?
Certainly, thanks for the question. So, when I first started thinking about trust and what I deemed or called playing inside the trust economy, what I was really thinking about then was, coming from a privacy and data protection background, was thinking about how is it that as we move more and more into a digital world and more into an information-based economy, individuals can feel that they can trust the system in which they're playing inside of, be that an economy or be that through the information that is accessible to them. And so what I started to think about is, in this digital and data world, we're more and more frequently relying on our trust to engage in new types of relationships. And those new types of relationships are happening with more and more frequency. And so what is it when I think about communities and when I think about businesses and when I think about governments, what is it that they need to do to further engender trust? And then I think in addition, as we start to think about COVID now and what that's bringing about in terms of the types of relationships that we have, we also need to think about trust and how we're going to reestablish or establish a new type of trust as we move back into the workplace, back into schools, back into parks, back into kind of our outside life. And so I think now trust is more and more important for us to think about in this interconnected world and in this world of pandemic management. And so I think, what we talk about is a framework of trust that really is along 4 dimensions. And those dimensions include financial, include digital, include the physical space, and the social space. And so really, what is it that we can think about in those 4 dimensions of trust? And certainly in the digital space, I think about the way in which security and privacy controls by design into those systems can help us think about trust. if we think back to, the establishment of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe that came into effect in 2018, part of the reason behind that was because the member states stood back and said, we're moving really rapidly into this digital economy. And how do we ensure that this digital economy will be successful if there's no trust in that system? How do we make sure consumers are going to be part of this system alongside the businesses, knowing all the cyber threats that exist? And so that regulation really brought in a new way of saying, this is going to help us establish trust. And so what that did is through structures of accountability. Who's going to be accountable for the information they have access to? How are they going to use it appropriately? What transparency is going to be in place with the individuals whose information they're collecting? And so instead of it being a zero-sum game, it's really changing it around and saying we want to be in a positive-sum game or a non-zero-sum game, where everyone is actually part of and can make decisions around how their information is being used, what's happening with that information, and the benefits back to them in entering into that kind of digital economy and that digital relationship. So I think now more than ever, trust is really important to that conversation. Sorry, did you want to add
Perfect.
something?
Yeah, well, I was just wanting to see if Josh wanted to just jump in a little bit, because we were talking about trust. He's just been writing for the Council on Foreign Relations about the UN and some of their entities trying to engender trust, not by pointing fingers at the creation of disinformation, but really concentrating on how to deal with the actual illegalities. So in this case, I think, Josh, you'd agree that the UN has been trying to gather as many people who agree as possible and to start creating some best practices. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure, certainly. And I'm very glad to hear, Robert, that at least someone read my article. So thank you for that. I mean, and I'll preface everything that I say with the fact that Ben Hiller is one of the world's foremost leading experts on confidence building measures, which really do try to build trust. But at the UN, some of what we're seeing in that kind of international picture, where trust is very important for stability, and things like clarity, accountability, transparency, all build trust and thereby more stability in the kind of international cyberspace. But there's been a very big push, especially from kind of Western states, to have countries, all kind of countries, lay out their positions on how international law applies in cyberspace, their interpretations of how these norms that have been discussed can be implemented, and what international law means, just to kind of get a better understanding of what different positions are, what different interpretations are out there. There's in my earlier remarks, I mentioned that countries are developing offensive cyber capabilities. And the position led by kind of the Five Eyes countries or the US, UK, Australia is increasingly that these military capabilities in cyberspace are okay. They're just a fact of life. They're here. I think NATO doesn't like to say the word offensive when talking about cyber capabilities, but I think NATO probably thinks similarly. But the thinking is that we have these capabilities, they're needed, but let's be as transparent as we can about their use, meaning that we will use them only in certain ways according to international law. We see that international humanitarian law might apply in armed conflict, and kind of really trying to be as clear as possible. Obviously, you have to be ambiguous to some extent on what your responses will be, what you'll see, what each country will see as the threshold for triggering some sort of response or consequences. But there are all sorts of things that can be these so-called CBMs, or confidence building measures, that involve countries laying out their positions more clearly and building transparency and clarity in the global space.
Perfect. Well then, Ben, Josh has already laid you out as one of the greatest experts on trust building. So would you like to expand a little bit on that idea as well?
Oh dear. Thank you, Josh. No pressure there. So yeah, I mean, if I may just expand a bit on what Josh said. Of course, when it comes to trust, and I talk about trust in cyber stability in the context of international peace and security. So talking very much of the value of trust in international relations when it comes to the use of information communication technologies by states. Now, I think our biggest challenge when it comes to trustful relations in cyberspace between states is not only what Josh said before, a very different interpretation of how cyberspace should be governed and what values we have, but also I think the persistent challenge of attribution. To attribute a cyber incident with without reasonable doubt to another actor, and what that means in terms of conducting activities below the radar, and what that in turn can impact on international relations and relations between states. So we have a bit of a trust challenge, to be honest, when it comes to cyberspace. But that's not a new realization. And that's why actually there have been so much work being done at the United Nations, as Josh has outlined, to create a system that allows states from very different paths of where they look at cyber and how cyberspace should be governed to actually engage in some form or another with the purpose of building confidence and trust. And essentially there are three elements to this. One, as Josh mentioned, there is agreement that international law applies as much offline as it does online. So that it is not a lawless space. So if you transgress and breach international law, there should be consequences. It is true that we need to clarify a couple of things when it comes to this first pillar. The second pillar in terms of building transparency and stability is what also Josh already mentioned, are those norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. There are I think 12 norms or 11 norms that have been agreed by states that should be applied by all, that marks responsible state behavior, including such things as to refrain to attack critical infrastructure on which civilian populations rely on. You could argue the healthcare sector. Mm-hmm. And the third pillar really of this framework that has been created is confidence building measures. And these are very practical measures. And I always say international law is super, norms are fantastic, but we also know that they're broken every day. So what you need to do is to create practical mechanisms that allow states to display good behavior, that allow states to communicate if there are incidents that could threaten relations between two states, such as like the red phone for cyber, if you want. So if something happens and one state accuses another state, you need mechanisms and communication lines that allow you to still reach out before things escalate. And this is what we call those practical confidence building measures. They're measures, very practical, that everyone can agree to despite ideological differences when it comes to cyber governance, and that can be instituted in order to prevent conflict from arising through cyber means, if you want. So the idea is things such as Josh already mentioned, exchange information on how you interpret international law when it comes to cyber. There are the exchange of, let's say, military doctrines on cyber. It all gives basically another state more of an idea where you come from. And if something happens, it's easier for states then, even in the absence of attribution, to read you better as a state, and a better determination if you want to say, okay, is this in or out of character for this certain state based on the knowledge that we proactively received from that state prior to this incident. So these are very practical measures that can allow states to demonstrate what they're all about in cyber. And that the hope is that this will make cyberspace more transparent, but also more predictable. So these are essentially the three elements. And of course, the fourth element is capacity building, because if you don't have the capacity build to be a good cyber neighbor, if you want, to prevent cyber attacks on your country from affecting others because you don't have the capabilities to defend, then you have a problem. Then you're not a trustful partner. So capacity building is the fourth pillar, if you want, in this basket of measures that allow states to be trustful cyber neighbors. So with all these four, I mean, we hope that by implementing them, and that's a whole different debate, implementation, operationalization of those measures, that we can reach a more cyber stable space, that there is more trust and confidence in each other, despite some of the challenges that are connected to attribution.
I find all of that fascinating. I'm sure most of our viewers do as well. I'm going to ask one more question for the panel, and then we're going to open it up. If there is anybody watching on YouTube live who would like to ask a question, there is a sidebar to the right, and you can input a question, and our moderators will collect it so that Nicole can ask after we're finished our last question here. But
Robert, I think it's important. Sorry, Robert. I think it's important to add to what Ben and Josh talked about, which is these four kind of tenets that you spoke about similarly can apply from a principles or an intention-based perspective as well to the way in which all organizations operate, right? So I know we're really focused right now on state and international alliances, but if I think about its application very much to the local, to the way in which businesses need to operate, and to the way in which businesses also need to establish operational resiliency and cyber resiliency through all of these different disruptive times, this type of approach is not dissimilar to the way in which we would see business organizations govern as well. And so I think that there's an opportunity also to learn from both sides, right? And to establish these good governance frameworks that apply not only to the way in which we treat our shareholders, our customers, our citizens, but also the way on a much more macro scale, we think about the way in which states can co-govern or co-collaborate. So I just want to say that I think, you know, there's a lot of shared understanding that we can bring to both sides from this as well.
100%. And what I'd like to get the three of you to comment on, I know some of you may not be able to comment, fully, but we are at a stage now where our different states, Canada, South Korea is a very prominent example, are using data to various degrees to aid in the current crisis. So there are some serious privacy concerns here that are emerging as the use of technologies to monitor people, to aid in the response to COVID. I'm just curious, with those four pillars, or just generally, especially with transparency, how do you think we can, in a multilateral sense, make sure that we take these considerations seriously and move forward with that kind of trust, that we can give it to the government, that we can allow a certain amount of monitoring or data access? Obviously a hot button issue. Any of you want to kind of take that at all?
I'm happy to start with that. So certainly, you're exactly right. The COVID and the pandemic has brought a whole new consideration around what type of information we need access to in order to manage the pandemic. It raises a lot of questions about how organizations, and be them private sector or public sector, are kind of rapidly designing responses to this pandemic. That response could be from how is it that they're going to, within their ecosystem, what is it they're going to do with their supply chain and their third parties? How is it they're going to get their employees into a remote workforce? How do they move their businesses online and still keep their customer base? So there's a bunch of questions there. There's also questions around, how do we start to monitor our citizens? How do we know if they're sick? How do we know they're staying home if they are? All of these questions are sort of requiring a new way of gaining access to information and using technology to do so. And I think what's really important is that we take a step back and we collectively ask ourselves questions about what ultimately are we trying to do. So if we think about pandemic management, do we really need to collect a whole bunch of new information about individuals, either in the employment context or in the healthcare context, in order to trace them, in order to monitor them, in order to manage the pandemic? And if we are going to collect all that information, if we are going to put in, technology that is going to allow for some level of monitoring or some level of tracing, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to inform people around the safety of it and the protection measures that are in place? How long are we going to keep that information for? How are we going to analyze it? Is it going to be used for profiling certain segments of the population? What does that mean? So it raises a whole bunch of questions around ethics, around privacy, around how we want to interact with one another. And I think that that's, as we return to a new normal and we've created these new constructs in which we're going to operate, we really need to think about what those new norms are going to be. And if we're comfortable with some of the kind of knee-jerk or quick reactions that we're taking to manage some of this. The flip side is that many of this is going to be required. So rapidly moving an entire workforce to a remote workforce, moving businesses online, changing the way in which your supply chain works, all of this is required in order to keep our societies and keep our economies moving forward. And so as we do that, we need to think about what are the very fast decisions that we made, and how do we now go back and understand what those quick decisions were that we made, and make sure that we haven't introduced undue risk into that process. And where we might have made some risk concessions in order to get quickly to market or quickly to get our workforce home and work remote, that we're taking a step back and we think about what is it that we need to actually do to manage that risk. And that's going to be a public-private partnership that has to take place. And that's something that's going to happen on a glal scale. And if we don't kind of think about that, yeah.
I would like to bring in the other two, if you want to just end your point there.
I was just going to say, if we don't sort of think about that holistically and start to put those parameters in place, then some of the attacks that we started to see within that cyber threat landscape will just continue to proliferate, because we've introduced the opportunity for more and more vulnerabilities to exist within that ecosystem. So I just think it's important, and that's where many of these multilateral opportunities will come into place.
Perfect. Ben, would you care to?
Sure. Similar to what Beth said, I think clearly what is vital as we move forward with these solutions is that they adhere to national laws and regulations anchored in international commitments when it comes to privacy. And also, I strongly believe they need to be targeted, and the data generated should only be used for the purpose of preventing the spread of a disease, and that's it. Obviously, coming from a NATO perspective, one concern with any application that tracks people is that it can potentially increase the attack surface. The question is it really in our interest that we track thousands of people, and what happens if actors get hold of those information that we don't want them to? Then we have a lot of things to do and sort out and to remedy. So we need to be very mindful of that. And that is the reason why I personally would say that it is important to take time with the development of these applications and to do a thorough job, and to have security very much designed in from the beginning in order for it not to be exploited.
Perfect. And Josh?
I don't have that much to add on this, and I know we're into questions, and it's not so much my area of expertise, but a lot of my colleagues are working on this kind of stuff. And as Ben said, building security in is very important, and also taking care to have oversight or accountability built into these programs, and things like Canada has an Ontario Privacy Commissioner and has a National Privacy Commissioner, and these watchdogs will be examining closely to see whether any measures comply with given laws and regulations, and that's very important. But I think we'll probably see very different models in different places across the world. These debates are unfolding. In Israel, there were heavy debates on whether the country's intelligence agency should be the one to be monitoring all these citizens' information, and I think that was struck down. The Supreme Court in Israel was displeased by that. But there are lots of debates also on who should be doing it. In the United States, Google is leading, Google and Apple, I believe, are leading the creation of an app, and some are criticizing it for saying it protects too much information and doesn't allow the government to have enough. And some are saying, well, that's perfect. That's exactly what we need. We need these kind of this kind of barrier between what the government can access. And so those are kind of some of the discussions, but that's all I have to say on that.
And I think that there are some good frameworks out there. So in the Canadian context, our privacy commissioner did collaborate and put out a set of guidance or principles around how is it that we manage in COVID from a technology perspective, making sure that we have the right types of principles built in around proportionality, around reasonableness, around the types of security safeguards you need, around accountability. So I think, again, you're seeing a mirroring of the types of discussions that take place, within NATO, for example, around what good governance means and how to appropriately manage and establish a cyber safe space. It's the same type of discussions that we're seeing take place within the healthcare system between healthcare and private organizations. In Canada, a lot of the questions are now around return to work. How do we safely bring employees back into the workforce, into physical locations? As a private corporation, can you actually enforce or require your employees to download apps that are going to monitor where they go within a building? So these are bringing about a lot of questions that we haven't necessarily had to answer before, and turning to some of the international standards that we have, the laws that we have, and some of the kind of guidance that we get, not just from our national regulators, but also from our international organizations and institutions that think about this and think about it in a more kind of social context as well, I think are going to be really important. And we can't forget about that. And I think we're, especially within Canada, we're really going to have to challenge ourselves, our employers, our governments, our other organizations around exactly what it is we want this new normal to look like as a community. And I don't know if we have all the answers for that yet, but I do think that there are some that are starting to push that boundary into a place we maybe don't want to be, which is a potential erosion of some of our civil liberties.
That's I'd just like to move now to some questions that we've had posted through Nicole, but I would like to just point out as well that NATO and the UN and other multilateral organizations are this perfect kind of hybrid because we've got the opportunity to experiment. We can take a look at, well, which countries seem to be doing the best, and then start picking our policies to try to emulate those policies. And it's almost a wonderful incubator in that way. We can utilize that through our alliances. All right, so I'd like to pass it off now to Nicole Dory, one of our outstanding program editors at the NATO Association. I believe you have a few questions for the panel, Nicole.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, everyone. That was a wonderful introduction. So we have a question from Ryan Atchison. How can deterrence apply to maintaining cyber stability? Are past concepts of deterrence applicable, or must newer concepts of deterrence be developed to respond to the challenges?
So that would be more towards Ben's side of things, but
yeah, so thanks for the question. Of course, deterrence has different meanings in different contexts, but I would like to understand deterrence as to deny someone to affect you. So basically enhancing the costs and reducing the benefits of someone to attack you. I think when it comes to cyber, and certainly from a NATO perspective, this is best done through resilience, to be able to respond and to prevent those malicious cyber activities from affecting you. And that, to be honest, is at the very core what NATO is doing. Already in 2016, allies have taken a cyber defense pledge where they decided to prioritize investment in cyber defense in order to be able to and be resilient to those cyber activities and basically deny perpetrators and threat actors the benefit of attacking you. So be prepared can mitigate and kind of increase the costs significantly. Equally, one of the key focuses of NATO is on education skills. Having the right people to defend your networks and with the right skills puts you at a unique advantage. So it's about investing in humans, in experts and expertise to defend your networks so that you make the job so much harder for perpetrators. But equally, I mean, we all know that we can't defend everything all the time. So you need to create measures and response of how you mitigate and how you deal with those cyber threats once they got through your defense in a way. And that's something that NATO allies, of course, are also discussing and have developed various strategies on how to deal with this. But it's also about helping out each other when it comes to resilience. So what NATO already decided a couple of years ago is to establish so-called rapid reaction teams when it comes to cyber that allies can draw on if they want to assist in mitigating cyber incidents. So helping each other out is another way of enhancing resilience. So these are just some examples of promoting resilience that also promotes deterrence, if you want, through denial and effectiveness of attacking you. And this is very much the way we would like to look at this issue. Having said that, of course, it is also important to be able to adequately respond to cyber attacks as an alliance. And allies made very clear, and I said at the beginning, that when it comes to cyber defense, it is part of NATO's collective defense. So if one ally is being affected, and this raises to a certain threshold, they can, in principle, trigger Article 5 with the agreement of all allies, so that everyone helps each other out in responding to the threat. So I think that is also a very deterrent message, is that we will stand together in defending ourselves, irrespective of where the threat comes from, including from cyberspace. And I think also a very visible sign of resolve in this regard comes from the fact that allies have decided that cyberspace is an operational domain. And what that means is that you operate as effectively in cyberspace as an alliance and allies as you do on land, air, and sea. And a very visible outcome, of course, of this is the Cyber Operations Center that was established within NATO command structure, which allows cyber or NATO commanders to draw on cyber for mission assurance. So again, all these steps, integrating cyber, mainstreaming cyber into your operations, making clear that there are red lines to adversaries. When you cross them, there will be a response, which is to be determined on the individual case-by-case basis by allies, but also the preparedness and the resilience piece all adds to a deterrence when it comes to cyberspace.
Which goes back to predictability as well, the red line aspect. Okay, Josh, you had a
yeah,
point?
I'll just say a few quick sets on that might be further to what Ben can say, given his position. And Ryan, feel free to reach out if there's something that I say that's of more interest or you have further questions. But it seems, at least based on my reading, that there are moves, there are, yes, these efforts in the United Nations to involve all countries in deciding together what are the rules and these kind of things. But we see repeatedly, even after in 2015, when all the countries agreed that we will not attack critical infrastructure, the Russians attacked electricity grids in Ukraine, wiped out power in the winter for several hours in Kiev. So these norms, there's been a conclusion, especially among the US, that there's also a need to impose consequences beyond just these voluntary norms. And if you look at the United States national, I think it's the National Cyber Strategy from 2018, they say somewhere, they talk about the creation of a cyber deterrence initiative of their allies and partners. And we've seen action along those lines that in terms of joint attributions, where a lot of similar countries are coming together to say it was you, or we all agree that it was you. And there's been talk about coming together to impose consequences. And so more of the deterrence, not by denial, but the kind of response is deterrence by cost or whatever the academic term is there. So I think there's a move that's still multilateral, not necessarily global. And whether that's good or bad, who knows? But the United States is really at the front of this with strategies such as persistent engagement and really deterring by more offensive means or exacting consequences.
Okay. Beth, I assume you don't have much as far as deterrence is concerned. All right. Sorry, do you or?
No, I was gonna say, like, in addition to what Ben said, being able to prepare and being able to test out your resilience plan, your incident response plan, thinking through the scenarios that might come. COVID's certainly introduced new scenarios. The change in the ways that we're working are introducing new scenarios. And so some of what you can do to be prepared will help with that.
Terrific. Nicole, I think we probably have time for 2 more questions. So let's try to be and then we'll see. I just want to make sure that all of our panelists are able to stay. So we'll keep your temperature on that, whether we can keep going after 2 questions. Go ahead, Nicole.
Thanks, Robert. So this is a question I believe all of you will have a different sort of take on. It's about the post-COVID-19. How can you deal with cybersecurity when more people are going to be working at home? And especially for Ben, and Josh will know this from his area in the dark web, and you, Beth, from a corporate perspective, how are you going to deal with unsecured networks and the fact that there are more risks of cyber attacks to corporate information, to security information, to military information? So maybe Beth, you can start.
So did you say Beth?
Yes.
I seem to not hear Beth and Ben well. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, certainly from a remote work perspective, you know, some of the things that we've seen, and I think the whole ecosystem has rapidly changed, right, because of how it is we're now working in a much more digital and remote environment. And so it's what I said before around, we have to actually understand what our new baseline is and some of the decisions that we made as we went into this uncertain world of COVID, and now go back and say, okay, well, what's the potential impact of those very fast decisions we made? The move of an entire workforce to remote and use of new technologies is something that can take organizations 6 months, 3 years even, to build roadmaps for and to fully implement. And we see companies and other organizations have done this in 6 to 8 weeks. And so we know that this has introduced risk and that the vulnerabilities are different. And Ben mentioned earlier, the attack surface is widened and broadened because of that. And so I think now is the opportunity, as we have moved into this phase of we've responded, we're starting to recover, and we want to move into a phase of kind of new normal. We need to go back and say, okay, well, what were all the decisions we made, and what's the right framework to put in place now to manage that going forward? So we have to think about our access controls. We need to think about the monitoring that we have in place. We need to think about the way in which we're going to share intelligence amongst organizations and the government. We need to ask ourselves, do we know what our crown jewels are now? Do we have different crown jewels than we had before? Do we know what those assets are and how they're being protected? Are we able to identify who has access to what information and what they're doing with it? Individuals' behavior is going to be different. So being able to monitor what people are doing in your networks, corporate or otherwise, is going to be different. So there's a whole bunch of new information and intel that we have to gather around how organizations are operating, how our employees are operating, that will help us understand what that new normal is so that we can put in the right types of security and data protection controls to protect it. So I think that those are going to be some of the things that we need to do. And if you go back and have a principle-based approach, a risk framework that, you know, understand what's business critical to you, what are the assets required to make that business critical operation happen, and then start to potentially plug some of those holes. That's probably one of the areas that you want to start.
Wonderful. Is there, Josh, would you like to jump in on that as well?
Yeah, sure. I can quickly speak to a few points. Largely that the director of Citizen Lab, Professor Ron Dewitt, gave a few weeks back in testimony to the House of Commons, especially in the Canadian context. He recommended certain things, given this kind of COVID environment, more working from home, more reliance on video telecommunications, certain recommendations like pushing for stronger encryption, transparent and accountable vulnerabilities equities processes. VEPs, these vulnerabilities equities processes, are how software vulnerabilities are released, and often the government has them and its intelligence agencies can use them as weapons. But if they keep them and don't release them so that companies can patch them, then it's more vulnerable for all. So making that process more accountable. Vulnerabilities disclosure policies as well, which means researchers who might find bugs and find vulnerabilities, how they can best facilitate these, say a researcher finds a flaw in Zoom, how able and comfortable are they to then disclose it to the government or the proper authorities. Also, things like the security services. For example, in Canada, we have the CSE's National Cybersecurity Center, or sorry, Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. They've begun sharing data with the private sector, with infrastructure providers on threat assessments, and all to try to reduce the likelihood of phishing or malware attacks. And that kind of cooperation and guidance or issuing best practices is very important as well.
Wonderful. So this is a question that I think will be best directed at Ben. And it's, how does the concept of right to protect, responsibility to protect, sorry, apply to cyber attacks on a nation?
Very good question. And it's actually also very, very relevant for Josh, because this goes right back into how do we apply international law when it comes to cyber stability. And as you know, there is a principle in international law that talks about due diligence, basically the responsibility of states to not only protect their infrastructure, but also to go against anyone using your networks to launch malicious activities onto other countries. So there is that principle, and that principle applies because states already decided that international law applies in its entirety when it comes to cyberspace. So it's the principle of due diligence, that you have a responsibility as a state to protect your population and also your other states by not allowing your territory to be used for malicious cyber activities. So that principle stands and it should be applied. I don't know, Josh, whether you want to add to that.
Well, I think what Ben said was very good, and all I'll say, and I suspect I might even guess who asked this question, but there's been a paper out by two people, one of whom is with the NATO Association of Canada, Tina Park, that's titled R2P and Cyberspace, Sovereignty is a Responsibility. I haven't yet had a chance to read it, but I look forward to reading it. And that if it's not Tina asking the question, then that will give some great answers, I'm sure. But I look forward to exploring that further in the piece.
Perfect. Well, yeah, well, why don't we just take a look. Ben, Beth, Josh, do we have time for a few more questions, all of you?
Sure.
Terrific. Nodding. All right. Nicole, why don't we take two more?
Okay. Sorry. So there was a question earlier about how can we take into account the human factor in cybersecurity. So they mentioned the fact that often in engineering chains, they say that the human is the weakest link. So how do we take that into account when trying to deal with cybersecurity?
I'm happy to start with that one. And actually it's something that I wanted to add to the two previous, well, not the last question, but the question before, when you talked about the impact of teleworking that might have. And I was going to add that one of the big challenge, as you said, and still one of the weakest links when it comes to cybersecurity are the end users, those users that click on malware or spam and thereby infect their machines. So end user education and awareness raising will become more and more central and important as we move to more and more teleworking. Having said that, it's also not news. I mean, this is known that this is a big challenge for a long time, and somehow we still have not managed yet to get the message across in a way that we see significant reduction in infections of ICT systems. So I think that's something that we will have to continue to focus on, and where we will have to spend money on, and maybe where we also need to think about how do we test that users are up to the job. I'm not talking about punishments or anything, but how do we make sure that, for instance, in a office environment that staff have to take cybersecurity awareness courses on a regular basis, that they are up to date with the latest threats and to know how to maneuver and use ICTs in a way that is safe and secure. So I think each company and organization will have to continue to ask these questions and will have to get better at this.
A wonderful answer. Josh, Beth, do either of you have something you'd like to add to that? No? Okay.
The only thing I would say is that the other thing about the human being the weakest link is that we're likely to see an increase in insider threats as well during this era, or during this time of uncertainty and the pandemic. And so thinking about what is it that employees have access to, or even by extension, your supply chain or your business partners, and if they have access to any of your systems, because the rise of insider threat, we're seeing that increase right now. We're also seeing that through other means like cyber warfare, individuals are actually being planted inside organizations. So while it's something that we've known for a while, the kind of fast and flurry activity around moving towards a different working environment, but also some of the work that's happening within the healthcare organization, R&D, and your IP, all of that is at threat or risk of being exposed. And one of the ways in which it's happening is through that insider threat or that insider link. So thinking about the types of controls you need to have in place to really be able to monitor and detect for that insider threat. So in addition to phishing campaigns and end user awareness, it's also really understanding who your end users are and what they might have access to and what they could do with it, and if any of that behavior looks unusual.
Wonderful. So this is a question from another one of our directors, and it is about how can we move forward with a balance of protecting people by using data when necessary and using applications such as the ones being created by Apple and Google or being used in South Korea, with the idea of not giving up more of our personal rights or liberties than we would like. Do any of you have a good answer to that, or would you like to jump in about the balancing act that goes forward?
Well, I think you've striked it there around your comment on the balancing act. So just because technology enables something and just because the data is there to take doesn't mean it's the correct response. And so I think really being able to manage and set up the right type of framework and make the decisions based on proportionality, based on responsibility, based on understanding what you actually need to do with that information, and then being really transparent in that with those who are going to be participating and using that technology. So I think if we're not asking those questions up front, and if we're not setting up the right type of framework to by design build the right types of controls and the right types of safeguards and the right type of thinking from an ethical perspective as well into the design of that, then they will likely end up over collecting, or information will get used inappropriately. So I don't think it's that we shouldn't be using the technology or we shouldn't be analyzing the data. I think it's really about setting up the right guardrails and the right framework to do so, and making sure that we're challenging ourselves when we do it.
If I may add to that, I agree 100%. And I think, to be honest, I personally am actually quite encouraged of how some of these developments have taken place. Certainly, if I look at some of the European states, even, when they started developing those applications, they immediately and from the beginning reached out to civil society organizations and took them on board. And in fact, in some instances, changed course midway because they listened to the concerns that were expressed by these associations, and with the result that they're probably going to have a much better application that is much more acceptable for citizens to be used. So certainly, I think from a European perspective and what we've seen here around us, that was actually some very good and encouraging signs and developments, and how this was approached.
Great. So the next question is directed at you, Josh. It is by Baldo Jones. I don't. So what efforts are being made to combat the spread of automated generation of misinformation via machine learning?
That might be a bit out of my remit, but in general, I think I kind of touched on this earlier, but information operations and disinformation is a tricky area to combat in general. A lot of people say that democracies are asymmetrically vulnerable to these kind of threats because, as I mentioned earlier, the less democratic or less open countries see information as a threat and try to control it. So it's harder for different kinds of information to get into their environments and their information spaces, whereas democracies value free speech and an open internet. And so all sorts of stuff can come all over the place, as we know from the US elections. And as really lots has been written about, but Laura Rosenberger has written a great piece in Foreign Affairs that really takes this stuff into account really well. And on the automated and ML AI stuff, I can't really comment. It's a bit past my remit, but I know that countries, especially Western democracies, are very careful with how they frame information operations. And the Netherlands recently carefully called some information operations a violation of international law, but they try to veer away from content issues, meaning what the information is, and look more at the effects, as in what the information targets. And I think I wrote a bit more about that in my recent Council of Foreign Relations article in terms of the Dutch interpretation there. But it's a very kind of tricky line in terms of politically balancing those issues.
Wonderful.
Ben, sorry, I just think, Ben, would you be able to just briefly sketch NATO's main point of view on disinformation, i.e. just transparency and telling the truth, and kind of trying to use that as a response?
Well, to be absolutely frank, disinformation is not my field of expertise, and there are other colleagues probably in NATO that would be better qualified to answer that question. Having said that, I think one of our key objectives is to set the record straight, to really clarify if NATO is spoken about, or if actors have tried to sow divisions between states that are allies, to set the record straight and to inform what is the reality rather than a myth. I think what we are quite good at is actually tracking misinformation, certainly when it gets to our to the area that NATO is concerned, but also kind of in protection of our missions. And I think what we are increasingly also doing is, or we are doing, is that we see there's a bit of interesting trend in the sense that known cyber threat actors in the past are more and more using disinformation techniques, tactics, and procedures for their gains, and kind of putting two different hats on, if you want. So using traditional cyber techniques to spread disinformation, but also the other way around, using disinformation to spread cyber threats and to infect machines. So there's a bit of a crossover that we certainly noticed more and more during this COVID crisis now. And that I think makes us very acutely aware that we need to bring these two communities, the cyber community and disinformation community, closer together, more closer than already has been the case. And in that sense, we're in a very fortunate position because we have both communities under one roof here at NATO, and we are ramping up cooperation as we speak.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question, if you guys are all willing to stay on for a couple more minutes. And I think this is a very good finishing up sort of question. And it is, how do states, or in your case, Beth, how do corporations as well, balance developing international norms for cybersecurity versus exposing the extent of their capabilities? So maybe Josh, would you like to start on that one?
So the question was balance international norms with the worries of exposing their capabilities, right?
Yeah.
So if I understand that correctly, that gets at wanting rules and things and stability in the first place, but also two things. One is maybe revealing things that they might be thinking about or doing, but also keeping the door open for them to operate in ways as they see fit. So for example, the United States, which is kind of the world's leading cyber power, so to say, it's sure, it is interested in a stability framework for all countries with rules and norms and international law, but it also wants a kind of freedom of operations to kind of do what it pleases. And so they have to balance these kind of things very carefully. I guess the question was asking, how do they balance it? Or
how can you balance?
How can you balance? That's, I mean, maybe Ben can get into the nuances there. I definitely understand that there needs to be a balance, but I think in the end, the United States and other kind of leading countries have concluded, and probably even China have concluded that stability is in the greatest interest of all. And that's what a lot of these norms have tried to do. There's this great Global Commission for Stability on Cyberspace that tried to develop new norms and things. And the effort behind this is to find rules and norms that are in everyone's interest, no matter what, and that kind of like are the lowest common denominator, things that everyone can agree are in everyone's interest. They're win-win. And that, like, part of that mentality or framing involves ignoring certain things that realistically countries will still want to do. Things like there's never been a norm against espionage, because all countries will always conduct intelligence operations and espionage. And that's just kind of an accepted, that itself is a norm, I guess, that countries will conduct espionage. So the balance is in finding what kind of is already in place and what is okay for everyone.
Wonderful. Would anyone else like to jump in on that last question? Ben?
I was hoping that this is going to go past me, because of course, talking from NATO headquarters is a very sensitive question, but I can agree with a lot what Josh said. I think when it comes to the norms debate and what is responsible state behavior in cyberspace, I mean, all these measures are really no-brainers. What everyone can coalesce around is how do we protect our population and citizens, despite of your ideological background. So what these norms really detail is, well, you shouldn't attack critical infrastructure because that might impact on populations negatively. You shouldn't target computer emergency response teams, which are, if you know, the ambulances of cyberspace. So it's kind of who extinguish the virus. They shouldn't be disabled. So in a way, these are all things that everyone should be absolutely fine with, irrespective where you come from. And on top of that, I think what the norms do allow is for states, but also CBMs and kind of issuing interpretations of international law, is to draw red lines. I think that's also very important for transparency. So it's not exposing necessarily your capabilities. It's basically saying this is how we perceive a stable cyberspace, and it would be good for everyone to accept or respect those red lines. And to be honest, when you look at the red lines, they're not too dissimilar for all states. It is very clear that if there's an attack that has human casualties, then that is not acceptable. But there are other areas, of course, as Josh said, when it comes to espionage. Well, this has been going on before. This is not new to cyber. And this is something that is not outlawed by international law in itself. So I think norms are a great common denominator, if you want, and something that everyone can agree to. And I think now the discussions will need to happen. Well, how do you operationalize those norms? Because they are voluntary. And how do you answer questions such as, well, what happens if norms are not respected? What are the consequences? And I think this is something, discussions that states are having at the United Nations and will have to continue to have.
I would just add, I guess, if I think about two specific examples from industry, so you could have the financial sector or the energy and resource sector. So within the financial sector, what you often will see is that that community will come together and for joint purposes work together and share information, but they may not go beyond their own sector. So if you think about financial crime or anti-money laundering and what they're trying to do around being able to monitor it, detect it, enforce rules around that, that requires a certain level of, you know, establishing capabilities, similar capabilities, sharing intelligence, working together, but it's also something where they don't want to open the kimono and show how they're doing that. Another would be in, like I said, energy and resources, when you have the industrial control systems and you have the grids and you have, you know, critical infrastructure there. Again, there's going to be a lot of both the public-private collaboration that needs to happen, but the industry has to work together in order to enforce and have certain standards in place to protect that critical infrastructure. So it's stuff that they need to work together, build capacity and build capability together and work together, but they're probably not going to do so where those outside of the need to know.
Perfect. Well, I think I'd like to thank Nicole for asking those questions, and for the audience for asking them as well. I think we'll probably call this to a close, but I would really like to thank Josh Gould, Ben Hiller, and Beth Dewitt. Ben especially, I know it's past 5 o'clock in Brussels, so you've been very kind to stay late on a Friday afternoon. But I really do appreciate all of your input. The discussion, I think, was extremely valuable for stirring the pot a little bit, especially bringing up some of the different concepts in different contexts. So I really appreciate that. If you were here, I would give you all a bottle of wine or something else appropriate. As it is, it'll have to be an IOU, but sincerely thank you. And for those who are watching, the NATO Association would love to continue this discussion in many different ways. We are here to make sure that Canadians understand the value of security and the importance of NATO and how those things are impacted by the rules-based order generally, which was created after the Second World War to create peace and security. So we're all part of it. It's on everyone's shoulders. This isn't something we can just sit back and watch. Any of you who are out there, you're part of the team that helps to produce the peace and security that we enjoy. So don't take it for granted. I hope you'll join us for our next event, which will be in the coming weeks. And thanks again to our speakers, Josh, Ben, and Beth. A real pleasure. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks for having me, and thanks.
Thank you.
And cheers, Nicole.
Thanks, Nicole. Bye.